Christine Cronau will be talking on the fat revolution, and she will be talking about many topics covered in her exceptional book. In her book, she addresses why did she use the term the fat revolution? Because the majority of women and many men struggle with their weight if they eat a low-fat diet. Because people diagnosed with heart disease often receive exactly the wrong advice for their health. Because we are suffering from man-made diseases, i.e. nutritional diseases, that we can really only correct by changing what we eat.
Now, how exciting is this? I mean, I don't know how Karen and Tim Noakes did this, but they really have pulled together the top low-carb, high-fat speakers from all over the world into the one place. So it's a once-in-a-lifetime event, and I'm super excited to be part of it. So my subject, saturated fat, it's an exciting topic, it's controversial, and I love talking about it. So we're going to have a bit of fun with it. Now, conventional health guidelines want us to reduce our fat, especially saturated fat. And many of you have probably been following those guidelines most of your lives, so you still might find this topic confronting. Others of you may have read now that saturated fat might not be the culprit it was made out to be. But you might still feel hesitant about it. You might be worried about talking to your patients about it. And others of you may have had fantastic results already with low carb, high fat. But you might hear all these voices around you, whether it's coming from other health practitioners, or from the health authorities, or from colleagues, or even in the media, telling you why low carb, high fat diets are dangerous. And they might be saying things like they cause cancer, or they cause heart disease, or they're acid forming, or they cause constipation. And then there's of course the rest of you who didn't need to be asked twice once you heard the words butter and bacon. So whatever you're thinking or feeling will show you why the vilification of fat really was the biggest health mistake in history. And also why all those arguments against low carb, high fat are simply hot air. And we'll also explain why eating more fat will actually help you or your patients lose weight and boost health and vitality. How does that sound? Now, just in case you haven't seen me speak before and you might be wondering, well, has she even ever been on a diet in her life? Well, this was me in my early 20s. I started struggling with my weight very early on. Now, of course, I tried all kinds of diets. Have you noticed that the first thing you lose on a diet is your good mood? Aren't they awful? Now, not only was I struggling with my weight, but I had a list of health conditions as long as my arm: chronic fatigue, IBS, leaky gut. And even though I'd grown up on mostly low-fat, whole grain, fairly low sugar diet, we pretty much only had it on birthdays. I had high blood sugar, I had insulin resistance, I had hypoglycemia. So if I was on such a healthy diet, what the heck was happening? Well, the good news is that 20 years later, in my mid-40s, now I feel better than I ever did in my early 20s on a low-fat diet. How did I do it? Well, I started eating all those forbidden foods: butter, bacon, eggs, whipped cream, the whole thing. And some of you would be quite shocked at just how indulgent I am with my food. This is a typical breakfast for me, and have a look at the butter in the back corner. That will go on my plate. And I know this flies in the face of conventional wisdom, but I've been doing this for 14 years. And not only have I gotten rid of every single one of those conditions, but I never have to think about my weight. I never have to think about dieting. I never have to think about counting calories. In addition, all my health markers are normal. So something to think about, right? Now, I love what I do because it is making a profound difference to people's lives. I receive daily success stories, not just about weight loss, but all kinds of improved health conditions. Everything from acne to Hashimoto's. And in the 10 plus years that I've studied health and nutrition, I have discovered that the majority of our health messages are incorrect. So that's why I actually feel obligated to share my message. So how did we get it so backwards? Well, we drastically changed our diet in the early 1900s. So between 1890 and 1920, we actually doubled sugar consumption, and it didn't stop there. It's now 12 or 13 times what it was back in the late 1800s. And by 1926, we had our very first documented case of a heart attack. And by the 1950s, heart disease was common, and experts were really scrounging for a solution. Now, of course, there was the theory that it was saturated fat. But the scientists at the time actually didn't agree. In fact, when it was first presented in Geneva, it was laughed at practically. But over time, the right people got into the right places at the right time, and it became more accepted. And by the 1970s, experts were pleading with health authorities not to change the guidelines because we simply had no evidence to show that saturated fat intake was the problem. And in fact, this is a beautiful little clip that we have from CBS showing the McGovern Committee, which Zoe mentioned previously, where they were talking about this very topic.
I have pleaded in my report and will plead again orally here for more research on the problem before we make announcements to the American public.
Well, I would only argue that senators don't have the luxury that a research scientist does of waiting until every last shred of evidence is in.
And here we all thought it was based on evidence, right? How fantastic to know that we've been part of the biggest failed experiment, and we've all suffered for it. Now, just like Zoe mentioned before, she has also done research in this field. She looked at all the studies that were available at the time that they changed the guidelines, and again found absolutely no correlation between saturated fat intake and heart disease. Now, of course, the pleas back then fell on deaf ears, and by the 1980s we had the low-fat era in full swing. It was supposed to make us slim, and it was supposed to slash heart disease rates. But what did it do? It did the opposite. So in developed countries, we became fatter and fatter, and we all know what happened to heart disease rates. So 60 years on, the low-fat era was the biggest health failure. So what does Time magazine say now? Well, it's really come full circle, because now they say eat butter. So it really was never saturated fat. But if we're looking at saturated fat, how is it, if it's got more calories than protein and carbohydrate, how is it that it's not making us gain weight? Well, it's because different calories actually act completely differently in the body. Some actually prompt fat storage, some don't. That's why it's meaningless to count them as if they're all the same. So saturated fat, surprisingly, is actually the least likely to prompt any sort of fat storage. So what's the real culprit? Well, when we eat sugar and carbs, as most of you know, we have to produce insulin to get the glucose where it needs to go in the body. But the important thing that's often overlooked is we can only use or store a small amount at any one time. So if we eat more than that, we have to store the remainder as fat in most cases. Now, is this a bad process? It's not, and in fact it's important in times of famine. But especially once we got rid of the fat, what did we have to replace it with? Sugar and carbohydrates. So we're eating more now than we ever have before in history. So we have to produce all this insulin. And of course that means we have to store more and more fat. And eventually our body struggles and we become insulin resistant. Then we have to produce even more insulin. And then, of course, in many cases, we stop producing insulin altogether. Then we have type 2 diabetes. And as an interesting side note, what happens when we can't get that glucose into our brain? Our brain cells start to die. Then we have Alzheimer's. So no matter what we hear in the media, this disease is completely preventable, as are most other modern diseases. So what about heart disease? They insist on a direct link between saturated fat intake and heart disease. But interestingly, the scientists have been shocked to find that that build-up in our arteries is not really composed of saturated fat. It's mostly something else. It's actually polyunsaturated fat, which comes from all those heart-healthy vegetable oils. And the other thing is that excess sugar and carbohydrate have been shown in study after study to increase risk for heart disease. They do that in a few different ways. I'll cover one of them later on in the presentation, but there's another interesting one. If we look at this, if we have glucose that's trapped in our bloodstream, it's going to change the consistency of our blood. It actually becomes quite irritating. So then we end up with little irritations in our artery vessels. Those irritations have to be covered with a scab. Then we have to cover over with another scab because they get irritated. So we end up with this huge build-up. And of course, it's acute thrombosis, and it's why most diabetics will actually die from heart disease. But what do our health experts continually tell us to do? To have low-fat products loaded with sugar. So what's the answer? Well, to me, it's low-carb, high-fat. But what is it? I mean, there are so many opinions on low-carb, high-fat. Well, to me, it's about finding your sweet spot. How do we know? If we know we can only use or store a very small amount of carbohydrate at any one time, how much is that for us? Well, members of my website can actually go in and calculate it because it depends on their size and also the state of their health. They can also calculate their protein intake and their fat intake. And I can guarantee you that most people are shocked at just how high that fat intake is. A lot of people think they're going high fat until they sit down and have a meal with me, and then they're like, oh, that's what you were talking about. So we do need those fats. But the other interesting thing is that it also depends on the state of our health. So if we are insulin resistant, for example, then we actually react differently to carbohydrates than a healthy person does, even healthy carbohydrates. So this is a fantastic study that was found by Professor Grant Schofield in New Zealand, and it measured the glycemic and insulin response in healthy people and also those that were insulin resistant. Now, the red line is the glucose, the other lines are complex carbohydrates, in this case, legumes. Now, interestingly, have a look at the insulin-resistant person. So the response to the complex carbohydrates is higher in an insulin-resistant person than for glucose in a regular person. Interesting, right? Now let's have a look at the insulin response. Again, when the glucose is the red, have a look at the complex carbohydrates for an insulin-resistant person. And what do they tell us to feed our type 2 diabetics? Complex carbohydrates, tons of them. Well, they're having this sort of response. So if we are insulin resistant, or if we do have another health issue, it's extremely beneficial to drop the carbs even lower for a period, say around 20 or 30 grams. A very low ketogenic diet, because it forces the body to go back into its natural fat-burning state, and it also knocks insulin resistance on its head. Now, if you do it for long enough, and most people find around 3 months is good, but I actually, when I was first starting low carb, high fat, I was so unwell that I did it for 12 months. I probably could have done it for less, but I got used to it, and I just decided to do it. Now, interestingly, now that I've come back to my ideal, which is under 60 grams for me, now I eat sweet potato, I eat muffins that I've made with buckwheat, I eat fruit, I eat potato, which shocks a lot of people. Of course, I add lots of butter and cream and all the other tasty things to it, but I am still in that ketogenic, fat-burning, fat-adapted state, and I have been for the last 14 years. How fantastic is that? So once we heal the body, it's incredible what happens. And really, ideally, we all want to be burning fat for energy. So to me, that's low carb, high fat. And of course, many people all over the world have had beautiful results with low carb, high fat. All kinds of things have healed. You know, their skin clears up, their IBS goes away, their bloating goes away, their hypertension goes, their type 2 diabetes symptoms are gone, their blood markers improve, their arteries clear. And of course, the skeptics say, wow, that's amazing, but you know, you shouldn't do that long term, it's bad for your health, right? So what are the most common objections that we're likely to hear about why low carb, high fat is dangerous? Well, I'm going to run through them right now. The first one is fibre. Now, of course, being on social media and having a controversial message, I often get trolls on my website or my Facebook, and I can't tell you how many times I've heard, man, I'd hate to see your insides. Well, I hate to break it to them, but it's actually the other way around, and that's because excess fibre that we're told we need to have loads of is actually extremely damaging for the bowel. Does anyone know how it actually makes us regular? It actually tears holes in the bowel wall, which releases a mucus that helps everything pass through. How fantastic. Well, not only is it extremely damaging, but it actually creates fibre dependence as well. So then what happens if we get rid of all that fibre and we go on low carb, high fat? The bowel slow down, and then, you know, skeptic over here will say, see, I told you that diet's bad for you. It's not the diet. It's actually the fibre damage. If there's a small amount of fibre damage, then low carb, high fat's fantastic because fat is extremely nourishing for the bowel. Those people who eat the most fat normally have the healthiest bowels. But if there's a lot of damage, and unfortunately most people are in that boat these days because of the Western diet, then we actually need to support that bowel while it heals. And I've written some very easy solutions in the Fat Revolution on how to do it, but it's important to do it. Otherwise, we are stockpiling waste in our bowel, or we're also recirculating toxins. Now, there's one other huge advantage to getting rid of all this excess fibre. Anyone know what it is? Just shout it out. Bloating and gas. Now, I remember watching an Oprah show once where they challenged the entire staff to go vegan for a week. It was many moons ago. Biggest complaint? Bloating. Gas. Now, they tried to say it's going to get better in time. It doesn't, and that's because this insoluble fibre is actually indigestible in the bowel. So we have to ferment it by bacteria. And the byproduct of that process is gas. There's no way around it, there's no way to make it better. So I often say that low carb, high fat's about freedom. Well, I can tell you, this is one of the biggest freedoms there is. Now, of course, there are many groups all over the world, health authorities, that we get a lot of backlash from. And in fact, a very big health authority in Australia has been coming out publicly and telling us that paleo diets, low carb, high fat diets are dangerous because we're eliminating whole grains and a few other reasons which I'll go into. Now, I actually asked this health authority, I said, can you please explain which nutrient we are going to be missing that's causing it to be dangerous? So they gave me this list, a pretty big list, but we can get every single one of those nutrients from other foods. And in fact, just like Zoe was saying before, most of them are far better sources than whole grains. So I then went back and I said, well, we can get all these from here. So again, what's the single nutrient we are going to be missing, thus making the diet dangerous? Well, all we heard was crickets after that. Complete silence. They will not answer the question because they cannot answer the question. And the other thing to remember with whole grains is that they are full of plant toxins. On top of the excess fibre issue that I was talking about before, they're full of plant toxins. Now, these are there to protect them against birds and insects, but they do act like allergens in our digestive system. Now, the primal groups that had small amounts of grain in their diet used to actually ferment or soak their grains so that they could neutralise these plant toxins. This is something we've forgotten how to do. On top of that, they're telling us that we have to eat between 6 and 11 serves every single day. So no wonder we have such an epidemic of IBS, leaky gut, and all the other digestive issues that we have these days. And the other thing, of course, is that excess grains do make us fat, and we already know that. So this one's closely related, and in fact, a dietitian came out publicly and said people on low-carb, high-fat diets in Australia, they said that it was actually child abuse because they're not getting their nutrition. Well, what they don't realise is if we start our day with eggs, butter and a side of tomato, we've already packed in vitamins A, B, C, D, E and K, plus a whole load of other nutrients. If we add unrefined salt, we've added over 80 other minerals. So the other thing we've forgotten is that fat itself is nutrient dense. And in fact, there are some nutrients that we are not getting anymore because we've eliminated fat from our diet. So the two big ones are true vitamin A and vitamin K2. Now, vitamin K2 is essential for development in children. It's also, just one of the fun things it does is it prevents heart disease. Now, why have we eliminated it from our diet? Because the best sources are grass-fed butter, pastured egg yolks, and soft cheeses, all of which have been demonised. Now, that's it. If you eat these fatty foods, I'm going to say it, it prevents heart disease. So when we take those away, and that's because basically if we do have calcium build-up in our arteries from having a high sugar inflammatory diet, this vitamin K2 comes and helps clear it out. So when we take away fats, we actually increase our risk of heart disease. The next one, of course, is, and you've probably seen big headlines like this, isn't meat acid forming? You know, people say you're relying on a lot of acidic foods like meat, dairy and eggs. Well, what are they actually talking about? They're talking about our pH, which is, of course, our concentration of oxygen and hydrogen. If we have more hydrogen, we have less oxygen. Does it matter? Actually, it matters quite a bit. And in fact, if we become acidic, then we actually change our entire metabolism. This is when we change from burning fat for energy to burning sugar for energy. Have you ever heard that our natural preference is to burn sugar for energy? So we need to eat sugar, right? Well, actually, it's not. Our natural preference is to burn fat for energy, but we change that. Once we start ingesting all this sugar, we have to burn it off to get rid of it. It's not a good situation to be in. But if it keeps coming in, we have to keep burning it off. We end up permanent sugar burners instead of burning fat for energy. And of course, then we have less oxygen to our cells. This creates a diseased environment, and we become a breeding ground for candida and fungus. Now, you don't have to look very far to see this is a problem, right? All the television ads for creams and all kinds of things for athlete's foot, thrush, and all kinds of other fungal problems. It's not because we picked up something on the bathroom floor, it's because we've got candida breeding inside. The other thing is it promotes premature aging and connective tissue breakdown. So especially in athletics, we often think it's normal as we, use things too much, and also as we get older that we're going to have a knee go or an elbow go. It's actually not. It's actually connective tissue breakdown. It's not normal aging. So I once heard a naturopath talking about this, and he said, do you ever feel like you're falling apart? And there was a resounding yes in the room, and he said, well, you kind of are. And that's because of the connective tissue breakdown if we can't get our bodies back into its normal, healthy state. Now, this is the most important point I'm going to make. If this is the only one you remember today, then this is good to remember. Because we need to keep our bodies in an alkalized position. And in fact, we have to keep the blood alkalized, otherwise we die. So most of you know that. But so if we're eating all these acid-forming foods all the time, which we do get from a Western diet, we have to constantly buffer. One of our extreme buffering systems is to actually pull phosphate from the bones. Now, of course, what comes with it? If we're pulling phosphate from the bones, what's coming with it? Calcium. Now, this is the real reason for osteoporosis epidemic. We are pulling calcium from our bones from a very young age. If we've got tooth decay as a child, we've got bone loss. And that's why tooth decay is more and more a problem. Now, that's not even my real point. What happens when we use that phosphate? We've then got free calcium. Now, calcium needs to be bound, otherwise it's not safe in the body. It goes around calcifying things. Now, what could possibly go wrong here? What about our heart valves or our arteries? What about gallstones? We've all been told that it's a high-fat diet that causes gallstones. Well, it's actually a low-fat diet that causes gallstones because that's why we're calcifying cholesterol in our gallbladder. What about kidney stones, bone spurs, arthritis? Think about all the problems we can have from this free calcium. And if you want to learn more about free calcium excess, there's some fantastic research done by Sam Queen in the States. So, of course, this leads to chronic disease such as heart disease and cancer. So, what does it all mean? Well, if we're testing our pH, if we test our saliva, for example, if we come out at 7, that's neutral. If we're below, we're acidic. If we're above, we're alkalized. Now, why? Going back to the original point, why is it that they say that meat, dairy and eggs are acid-forming? Well, probably because they're acids. Now, why are they acids? Well, because they're full of amino acids and fatty acids. Now, most of you would know that those things we do need. We have things called essential amino acids, essential fatty acids. We are meant to eat these guys. But why don't we look at something even more acidic? Something like lemons, limes, apple cider vinegar, much more acidic than meat. But do you ever see headlines that say, man, you've got to watch those lemons. They're going to make you acidic. Of course not. And in fact, the malic acid and other fantastic acids in lemons, limes and apple cider vinegar will actually prompt our body to produce bicarbonate, which of course is alkalizing. What about something like sugar? Sugar's not acidic on that scale, on the pH scale. But when we eat it, it actually produces acid in the body, so it's acid forming. What about grains? They're slightly acidic. Again, they produce acid in the body, so they are acid forming. So it's not what something is when it comes in, it's what happens biochemically once it's in the body. That's what we have to understand. Now, one other thing I'll talk about the meat first. So not only does the meat also contain acids that prompt our body to produce bicarbonate, but they also help us expel acids. There's 2 ways to expel acids from the body. One is through the lungs, one is through the kidneys. And if we don't eat enough protein, it's very, very difficult to concentrate those acids in the kidney and expel them. So it's actually really important to eat complete protein from animal sources. It's actually part of our alkalizing process. So not only are they not acid forming, they are actually alkalizing. And one other thing I must mention is aspartame. Now, I know a lot of people use aspartame instead of sugar when they go on a low-carb, high-fat diet, but it's extremely acid-forming. And the other thing is that we have a doctor in Brisbane, back where I live, who's an MS specialist. And he says that over 70% of the people who are referred to him for MS symptoms do not have MS at all. They actually have aspartame poisoning. It's a toxic substance. So not only is it acid forming, but there's other issues as well. So the best way to alkalise the body is actually to go low carb, high fat. And take a lemon drink every morning with your lemon, lime and apple cider vinegar. Now, if apple cider vinegar is too strong for some people, lemon is the most alkalising out of all of them. So there goes that one, and of course this is closely related to the next one. Every couple of years we have a massive paper that comes out that says that meat causes cancer. But the great thing about the internet is that we can actually go and analyse these studies ourselves. We can look at the data. And in fact, Dr. Einfeld, who's speaking later in the program, did a fantastic analysis of this particular study a couple of years ago. And the data actually said that the people who died earlier from heart disease and cancer smoked more, exercised less, were more diabetic, more hypertensive, ate more in general, ate more white bread, ate less vegetables and fruit, took less vitamins, and they ate more red meat. There it is. Now, I don't know about you, but if I came up with that conclusion based on that data and people could read it, I'd be embarrassed. But this is something that's done all the time. And unfortunately, the general public doesn't get to hear the real data. What about sugar being essential? We've all heard this one, we must eat sugar, right? Because it's essential for our brain and it's also our preferred energy source. Well, I already discussed the fact that it's not our preferred energy source. Our preferred energy source is fat. And in fact, when we burn fat for energy, fatty acids are converted into ketones. Now, ketones also has become a dirty word. You know, it's going to damage our kidneys, blah, blah, blah. But the fact is that the majority of our ancestors would have been on a ketogenic diet because there simply was no other way to live. They did not have access to the carbohydrates that we have now. That means that we've come out of that state. And the brain actually runs best on a mixture of glucose plus ketones. Now, you might be thinking, well, if it runs best on glucose and ketones, don't we need the glucose? Don't we therefore need the sugar, right? But actually, there's no situation, no matter how low your carbs go, if you eat no carbs at all, then the liver actually converts those amino acids into glucose. And that's actually why we're often told don't eat too much protein, because it can, if you eat too much of it, it can start acting like a carbohydrate. Fortunately, if you do eat enough fat, and I mean really eat enough fat, then that's very hard to do because you're going to feel full. It's on low-fat diets that we tend to overdo protein. Now, this book is a fantastic example because Dr. Stephenson actually went and lived with the Inuit for 15 years, and he was shocked at how robust and healthy they were. They had a diet of meat, fish, and blubber. That's pretty much it. So we like to add a little bit of carbohydrates for a bit of flavour, a bit of fun, but they are in no way essential. Now, of course, there's a lot of talk at the moment about thyroid as well. Low-carb diets damaging the thyroid. And in fact, it's not low-carb diets that damage the thyroid, it's actually a low-fat diet that damages the thyroid. And that's because when we go low-fat, we actually go into a state of a starvation stress. Our thyroid slows down, our metabolism slows down, and we start actually conserving our body fat. But because we have a lack of animal protein, a lack of fat, a lack of zinc, selenium, iodine, all those essential nutrients, then we really struggle with thyroid function. So if it's actually low-fat diets that's doing the damage, why do people swear up and down black and blue that they started experiencing symptoms like hair loss and cold hands and feet when they went on a low-carb diet? Well, if we think about what low-carb, high-fat is, it's actually a detox diet. And in fact, if you go to a heavy metal specialist for a detox, if they know what they're doing, they'll put you on low carb, high fat, because we need the fats and we need the proteins to detox the body. So of course, what happens on a detox? Often things we're already experiencing become worse temporarily, and you may not even have been aware that you had thyroid damage. And in fact, many people who've written into me, once you delve into it a bit further, they've had hair loss previously on low-fat diets. And any low-carb, high-fat practitioner will tell you that long-term, low-carb, high-fat will actually heal the thyroid. So there goes another one. And second last one, this is one of my favourites. If only I had $1 for every time I heard this, then I'd have another income stream. They say, she has a good metabolism, it's not going to work for you. Well, is this true? Well, let's talk about my metabolism first. I actually grew up on mostly carbohydrate. We were extremely poor. We were lucky, between the 9 of us, if we had 2 boiling chickens on a Sunday as a treat. So very little fat, very little protein. And I grew up really skinny, as you would expect. But once I hit 18, I started to spread. And this is actually really common with poor kids. And that's why you can go to third world countries, especially those that are reliant on white flour and sugar, and see obese mothers with tiny malnourished babies. So it's not my metabolism. What about my genes? Do I just have fantastic genes? I can eat whatever I want? Well, this is actually my grandmother. She struggled with obesity and diabetes her entire life. Now, we only have this one photo of her because she refused to have a photo taken. And we all know what that's like, right? When we're feeling heavy, we don't want to be in a picture. We don't want any record of it. We don't want to look in the mirror. Now, she had this photo taken after she'd lost a lot of weight because the doctor put her on a strict diet. She had to eat nothing for 3 days and then 600 calories a day. And she did that for a really long time. She eventually came down to 82 kilos, which my maths isn't very good, around 180 pounds. So she's still heavy, but much lighter than she was. She was extremely proud of herself. But of course, as we all know, what happens? It's not sustainable. You can't eat 600 calories for the rest of your life a day. So of course, she'd gain the weight back plus interest. And she struggled with this her entire life. The interesting thing is that she only ever had low-fat diet food in the house, ever. But now, of course, we know that that diet food was making her fat. Extremely sad. She was over 150 kilos when she died. What about my other grandmother? Now, she never actually became overweight, but only because she refused to. It was never going to happen. She was not going to be over a size 12. And she used to say, no, thank you, I have to watch my girlish figure. Now, I used to think, oh, that's so cute, but years later, now that I understand what was happening, how sad. She spent her entire life dieting. And of course, years later, she had a stroke. Why do I say of course? Because we've known for many, many years that low-fat diets, especially extreme long-term ones, increase risk for stroke. She ate even less after her stroke, which means that she had another stroke. And that's because she couldn't move anymore, so she didn't want to eat too much. So extremely sad. Again, she died prematurely. What about my own mother? Now, bless her, she followed in her mother's footsteps. She spent her entire life dieting. And, I remember her being thin most of my life. But I also remember her grapefruit diets, half a grapefruit for breakfast, half a grapefruit for lunch, brown sugar on top, low-calorie dinner at night. But now she's over 90 kilos, so she's quite heavy. And she hates it. She calls herself a fat pig. And it's really, really sad to watch. And unfortunately, she's been low-fat for so long and also dieting for so long that she's damaged her thyroid, she's damaged her metabolism, and really she has to go ketogenic to lose any weight at all, which she, of course, doesn't like doing. And also, I've been trying to get her to balance her pH, which she's been a little bit resistant to. But, she's going to have to work really hard now because her body has to heal from all that previous damage. But the good news is that since she went low carb, high fat, she's healthy. She just has all that extra weight. So I know for a fact that knowing my family history, knowing my metabolism, that if I had not changed my diet when I did, I would be overweight, no question, and I'd probably be obese. So one of the biggest criticisms we often get is, well, if it's so good, if low carb, high fat is so good, why doesn't it work for everyone? Well, I disagree. I actually think it does work for everyone, and I'll explain that more in a minute. But there are some major things major mistakes people can make on a low carb, high fat diet that can prevent weight loss. One of them is constipation. Like I mentioned previously, if we are not eliminating properly, we can accumulate around 5 kilos of extra waste in our bowel. Also, if we are recirculating toxins, then we tend to store our toxins in our fat cells. We do that to protect our organs. But if we're trying to protect our organs in our fat cells, we're not going to want to get rid of that fat. So it's really important to make sure elimination is working properly. Artificial sweeteners, that's another big mistake that's often made. Again, there are many papers to say just how toxic aspartame is, aspartame toxicity. And again, if we're toxic, again, we're going to be wanting to protect our organs from those toxins. And we store them in our fat cells. It also, of course, like I mentioned previously, is acid forming. Which leads to the next one, not balancing pH. Now, if we have been on a low-fat Western diet, then we're likely to be very acidic. Now, a lot of people, when they go low-carb, high-fat, they naturally balance their pH because the diet's a lot better. But if we don't have any acids in our diet, like lemons, then we can remain acidic. And we do actually have to actively balance our pH. And just like the toxins, if we are acidic, we start storing acid waste in our fat cells to protect our organs. And the last one, probably the most important one, especially for women. So if we think about what most women have done, we start dieting from a very young age, right? In fact, my daughter is 14 years old and she's got many friends at the moment who are dieting. It's really, really sad. So a lot of us have done that all our lives. When we diet, like I said before, we have to lower our thyroid function. We have to lower our metabolism. And we also start protecting our fat stores. It's a survival technique. So what typically happens when we go on a diet and then we go back to normal eating, whether it's low carb, high fat or not? We often gain weight, right? We gain back what we lost plus more. And that's because we're in that state. So, why is it that many men start low carb, high fat and they just lose weight like that? And their wives are going, what the hey, this is totally unfair. Well, it's because most men haven't spent their lives dieting. Now, there are many women out there who lose weight straight away as well, but there are some women who simply have to take the time to heal before they can get that result they were after when it comes to weight loss. And this is a fantastic example of what I'm talking about. I had a patient come and see me because she wasn't losing weight. And of course, I gave her some tips, but she'd actually recently had a heart attack. She had 2 stents put in and the remaining arteries were 30% blocked. Now, she was given the standard advice, go low fat and to go on cholesterol-lowering medication. She was very brave and she did the opposite. She went low carb, high fat. And of course, anyone doing that would be slightly nervous. Now, after I gave her that advice and she left, she contacted me a little while after because her results came in from her doctor. Now her cholesterol had come down, her triglycerides had come down, her homocysteine had come right down, and she had minimal identifiable plaque. 30% to minimal identifiable plaque from eating fat, eating more fat. So what she said to me was she was absolutely ecstatic with those results, and then she said, so the weight loss will come when it's good and ready. So it's fantastic that she could see her body was healing. So how can we possibly say it's not working? It absolutely works every time. We may just have to wait a little to get the weight loss results we were after. In summary, fat is not what's making us fat. And the real culprits are vegetable oil, shortening, margarine, and excess carbohydrate and sugar. Now, I know sometimes it is easier to just eat whatever we want and, don't worry about it, even if it makes us sluggish and more heavy than we'd like. But at what cost? I mean, most of us plan our financial retirement, but we forget to plan our health. So if you invest the time in your health today, you can save immeasurable amounts of time later in life when others of a similar age are struggling with illness and disease. And if you can do that, eating butter, bacon, eggs, crispy duck, pork crackling and whipped cream, why wouldn't you want to join the fat revolution? It's been a pleasure, everyone. Thank you very much.